History which has dedicated itself to destruction of the possibility of organized human life. That's actually what we're facing.
On Contact with Chris Hedges. Noam Chomsky is probably America's greatest intellectual, who has written on the Palestine-Israel conflict, the nature of the liberal class in a capitalist democracy, how imperialism works, as well as the reconfiguration of the American economy into an oligarchic system that makes war on the middle class. This is part one of our conversation with Professor Chomsky in his office at MIT. On Contact with Chris Hedges. So, Professor Chomsky, I wanted to ask you about the 10 principles that are laid out or have been organized in the book Requiem for the American Dream, which was based on the documentary that you did, the 10 principles of concentration of wealth and power. And the first one you talk about is reducing democracy. What do you mean by that?
I should first comment that the construction of the 10 principles is really the contribution of the editors. It's their quite effective consolidation of hours and hours of interviews and discussions, which they organized in this form. Reducing democracy means the gradual marginalization of the population, the reduction of the role of the general population in decision-making in the public arena, which is an expected and predictable consequence of the introduction of the transition to neoliberal principles in the 70s and onward. There's basically two general phases of post-war U.S. Socioeconomic history. The first phase was sometimes called regulated capitalism or embedded liberalism of the 50s and 60s, very high growth period, egalitarian growth, some moves towards social justice in the 60s, substantial increase in democratic participation. People became really engaged in the public arena. All of this had various effects. One effect was reduction, the falling rate of profit, which is critical. Second effect was people were becoming too engaged in public affairs.
This is what Samuel Huntington called an excess of democracy.
An excess of democracy. And in fact, two very important publications came out in the early 70s, both directed to this. They're interesting because they were at opposite ends of the political spectrum, but they basically came to the same conclusion with somewhat different rhetorical styles. One was the Powell Memorandum, Justice Powell Memorandum, which written by the late a corporate lawyer working for the tobacco corporations and so on, later became Supreme Court Justice under Nixon. He wrote a memorandum which was supposed to be confidential, but it leaked to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce business group, and in which he, the rhetoric is quite fascinating. He expressed the view of, which is not uncommon among those who really own the world, that their control is being very slightly diminished, and in the manner of a spoiled 3-year-old who doesn't get a piece of candy, that means the world's coming to an end. So you really have to read the rhetoric to appreciate it.
It's the attack on the American free enterprise system.
He said the business world is under severe attack,
right,
led by Ralph Nader and Herbert Marcuse.
In the universities,
and,
right.
And we're practically barely surviving, attack on all of everything significant in American life. And then he says, well, look, after all, we businessmen basically own everything. We are the trustees of the universities. We don't have to let these kids run wild and we can constrain the media. After all, we have the power. And it calls for mobilization of the business world to defend ourselves before.
But it became the blueprint, for this corporate money, the Heritage Foundation.
Yeah, it had a big impact on the growth of right-wing think tanks, much of the ideology of the far right. So that's at the right end of the spectrum. Then you go to the other end of the spectrum, basically Carter administration liberalism. In fact, the people who staffed the Carter administration, Trilateral Commission, it's industrial democracies, Europe, Japan, the United States, basically liberal internationalists. And they have a publication called The Crisis of Democracy. And the crisis of democracy is there's too much democracy. In the 1960s, too many people who are usually passive and apathetic, the way people are supposed to be, started becoming engaged in the political arena, pressing for their demands and so on. What are sometimes called special interests, meaning young people, old people, farmers, workers, in other words, everybody, except the corporate sector, which is not mentioned. They're the national interest. But these special interests are putting too much pressure on the state. So we have to have more moderation in democracy. People have to return to being passive and apathetic. The American rapporteur, who you mentioned, Sam Huntington, with some nostalgia referred to the period when, as he put it, Truman was able to run the country with the cooperation of a few Wall Street lawyers and executives. And then there was no crisis of democracy. That's kind of the way.
And they very effectively, of course, succeeded in rolling back. I want to go on to your next point about shaping ideology, but you talk about the difference between Madison and Aristotle, in that Aristotle, both of them understood that if there was inequality, in the same way that John Locke and Bentham and others did, that there would be tension between the rich and the poor. Madison calling for government to reduce democracy, Aristotle saying the solution which you obviously support is to reduce inequality. Yeah. Your second point, shaping the ideology, we mentioned the Powell memo, we mentioned the Trilateral Commission, but specifically they targeted various segments of the society, indoctrination of the young. You talk about the way they actually created architectural plans for colleges so that large demonstrations would not be possible, the use of student debt for debt peonage, the destruction of public institutions. Talk about that process to reconfigure the ideology into a form of neoliberalism.
Actually, I don't want to suggest that the Trilateral Commission led to these developments. It was more or less an articulation of the liberal elite consensus on these issues. And for that reason, it's quite interesting. So the phrase indoctrination of the young actually is their phrase, their consensus phrase. They said the institutions responsible for the indoctrination of the young are failing their duty.
Well, that's an interesting way to describe educational institutions.
It's kind of like the nostalgic comment on Truman being able to run the country with a few corporate lawyers and so on. But that's kind of the ideal. There should be indoctrination. Students should not be free to think. They don't put it this way, but what it means is they shouldn't be free to inquire, to think, to challenge, just the kind of things that in a decent educational system young people would be encouraged to do in the schools and universities. But it's dangerous because they're questioning too many eternal verities, including that there has to be elite domination and control. This is expressed all through the history of
How successful
thought.
do you think, looking back, that they were? How successful?
Well, it's not, as I say, they were they were articulating a consensus that led to many developments, and it's been reasonably successful. So, for example, take a kind of a business model began to be imposed on colleges and universities. There's been a tremendous growth of bureaucracy, tilting the balance from faculty control to bureaucratic control. There's been, of course, sharp raise in tuition, which has a very strong disciplinary effect. In the 1960s, young person could say, okay, I'm going to take off a year and get involved in the anti-war movement or the feminist movement or something, then I'll come back and continue my life. You can't do that if you have a burden of debt over your head. If you come out of law school thinking, I'd love to be a public interest lawyer, but I have to pay off $200,000 in debt, you just have to go to a corporate law firm and get absorbed into that culture. And in many different ways, there are disciplinary effects imposed. Cutback of state funding for state colleges, for example, has been very sharp.
You also talk about how suddenly critics of American empire or American capitalism got tarred with this anti-Americanism.
Yeah, anti-Americanism is a very interesting concept. It's a concept that only exists in totalitarian states. So, for example, if someone in Italy, let's say, is criticizing the Berlusconi government, they're not accused of being anti-Italian. In the Soviet Union, old Soviet Union, you could be condemned for being anti-Soviet. In the Brazilian military dictatorship, you could be anti-Brazilian. But aside from the United States, I don't know of any other non-totalitarian, non-authoritarian country where the concept even exists. It's a very striking concept. If you're critical of policy, you're anti-American. Actually, this has an interesting biblical origin. The first use of this concept is actually by King Ahab, who was the king of ultimate evil in the Bible. He called the prophet Elijah to him and asked him why he is a hater of Israel, meaning condemning the acts of the evil king. That's the basic concept. Authority, if you challenge authority, you're opposed to the society, the culture, the community, and so on.
And we see that with Trump. And we'll come back in a moment with our conversation with Professor Noam Chomsky. On Contact with Chris Hedges. Welcome back to our conversation with Professor Noam Chomsky. So let's talk about principle number 3, redesign the economy. I suppose this would have taken off, would you say, in the 1970s?
Began in the 70s. You see the first steps in the late Carter administration, then Reagan and Thatcher.
And what were they doing? What did you see?
Well, this is the so-called neoliberal shift to try to shift decisions from the public arena to what's called the market.
How do you define neoliberalism?
It's basically the idea is privatize, reduce the role of the public institutions, deregulate, encourage the growth of financial institutions, a network of policies of this kind. The ideology claims it's increasing freedom. It's actually increasing tyranny. It means that instead of decisions and choices being made in the public arena, where the public in principle has some kind of role into the state, to the degree that the state is democratic, maybe an actual role, shifting it to private tyrannies, corporate sector, mostly pretty highly monopolized oligopoly.
And that's when you get this imbalance between what you talk about, the manufacturing sector and the financial sector.
You also have enormous growth of the financial sector. So if you go to the 50s and 60s, the regulated capitalism period, banks were basically banks, put your money in them, they lent to people to start a business, something like that. From the early 70s, it shifted dramatically to speculate, a huge increase in speculation, complex financial instruments. By 2007, before the latest of the crashes for which the financial sector was mostly responsible, they actually had 40% of corporate
And
profits.
This is an economy where essentially you make money by manipulating money.
A shift in that degree. Actually, in the 1990s is when the decline of the manufacturing sector really began. And this was specific policy. It's a combination of trade policy and fiscal policy. go into the details, but that's essentially was the high dollar policy, the way in which the so-called free trade, not free trade agreements were structured, led to these effects. This is all part of the same system, and it's had consequences. One consequence is, for the majority of the population, stagnation or decline. Take a look at real wages.
Well, we should just talk, you speak about this. These free trade agreements, in essence, pushed the plight of the American worker downward because they had to be competitive with sweatshop workers in China.
That it was putting the working people of the world in competition, but allowing freedom of capital, and in fact high protection for capital. These are not free trade agreements. So the what's called intellectual property rights is just a huge tax on the population. It's massive increase in the patent rights, which had never existed before. So it means that a Microsoft monopoly can't be challenged. Mega corporations have extraordinary rights, and the effect of this is it's like a extremely high tariff is what it amounts to.
Well, you talk about how workers can't move, but capital can.
Yeah,
and that the whole capitalism itself, if you go back to Adam Smith, is based on the free circulation of labor. That's the foundation of a free trade.
That's Adam Smith, but there's nothing like that. Quite the opposite.
Let me ask about that. This created worker insecurity by design.
Yes, and in fact, the phrase "growing worker insecurity" is Alan Greenspan's, the kind of managing the system as head of the Fed. But when he was testifying to Congress on the success of the economy he was running, he attributed a large part of it to what he called growing worker insecurity.
Which he saw as a good thing.
That's the implication, because it keeps wages down, it keeps workers from asking for benefits, it keeps inflation low.
And it breaks unions.
And it keeps profits high.
And it makes it very hard to organize.
And he points out intelligently that this growing worker insecurity is so extreme that even when unemployment is down, as it was in the late Clinton years, still the same conditions apply. Workers are just afraid. Unions are being destroyed. And this is part of what was called the Great Moderation, by economists, the success of the neoliberal programs, which had the effect that, say, by 2007, before the crash, real wages were actually lower than they had been in 1979 when the neoliberal experiment began. That's a very sharp change. Actually, one index of the change, which is interesting, is just taking a look at minimum wage, which sets a kind of floor for wages. During the first period, regulated capitalism, minimum wage tracked productivity, which would be expected. It breaks in the 1970s. Productivity and growth go up more slowly, but somewhat. Minimum wage stays flat, which means it actually reduces. If minimum wage had continued, today it would probably be something like $20 an hour. And that's just like the actual reduction in real wages. That's an indication of the nature of these highly praised socioeconomic policies. Another effect was deregulation. Started actually in late Carter, but picked up with Reagan and extended under Clinton. That meant the beginning of crashes. In the 50s and 60s, there were no financial crashes. You had New Deal regulation. Starting in the 80s, you start getting crash after crash, each one worse than the last. And that's the nature of the system.
Let me move on to shifting the burden. Is another shifting the burden so that the oligarchic elites, I mean, especially Fortune 500 companies, are not paying taxes, and more of the responsibility for funding the nation falls on the backs of the working poor.
Actually, there's been a very sharp reduction in taxation of the wealthy since the 50s and 60s, right through the neoliberal period. And all sorts of other devices have been developed so that the corporate sector can avoid taxes. So, say, take the biggest company in the world, Apple, hugely profitable. They have an office somewhere in Ireland, which is allegedly where they're based. Of course, they're based
This is
here.
the offshoring.
That's the offshore base. They were just fined, I think, something like $13 billion or something like that by the European Union for tax evasion there, but it means they're not paying it here. And there's a lot of complaint from business, of course, about the high corporate tax. If you look at the effective corporate tax, what they actually pay, it's far lower.
This gives rise to what you call the precariat.
The precariat is the growing worker insecurity, the fact that you don't have the security of a stable job, which is going to be continuing work, which is going to be a guaranteed pension, a chance for your children to go to college. That's radically disappearing.
And you said that this system, to quote, we're headed towards a cliff.
It's headed towards a cliff in many ways. The worst cliff that we're heading towards is due to market systems. There's a fundamental flaw in markets. We have a very limited market. There's massive state intervention, but it's to some extent market principles prevail. In a market, you don't pay attention to externalities, to the effect of your transactions on others. So if I sell you a car, we make a good deal for ourselves, but we don't pay attention to the fact that there's another car on the street, there's more congestion, more accidents, more pollution, others suffer. Now there's one, if Goldman Sachs makes a risky transaction, if they're paying attention, they cover the risk to themselves.
That's what they did with subprime mortgages.
But they don't pay attention to what's called systemic risk,
right,
that the whole system may collapse. That's the public's problem.
Well, and climate change is perhaps...
But now we have climate change.
Right.
That's a externality which is going to destroy us unless something's done. And the position of the savage wing of American capitalism, the Republican Party, is quite striking. They are really racing towards a precipice.
Haven't you called them the most dangerous organization in world history? Was that the right?
I think that's, as I pointed out, that's an outrageous statement. But the question is it true? Has there ever been an organization in history which has dedicated itself to destruction of the possibility of organized human life? That's actually what we're facing. And they're pretty remarkable.
And the Trump administration has accelerated.
They've accelerated it, but they're at the peak of a Republican Party shift. Take a look at the last primaries. Every single candidate in the Republican primary either flatly denied that climate change is happening, or else said maybe it is, but we don't have to do anything about it. 100% denialism. The Paris negotiations concluded in December 2015 were intended to reach a verifiable treaty. They couldn't and had to just keep to promises because the Republican Congress wouldn't permit it. By now, November 8th, last November 8th, the U.S. just basically pulled out. It's now isolated in the world, literally isolated, in racing toward the precipice while the rest of the world is trying to do something, not enough, but at least something to deal with the problem.
Right, thanks. That was Professor Noam Chomsky. This is the second part of our conversation at his office at MIT, focusing on his latest book, Requiem for the American Dream. On Contact with Chris Hedges. So principle number 5, attack solidarity, and you bring up Social Security. When we're watching this happen as we speak, well, what is this about?
Solidarity means concern for the fate of others. So I don't have children or grandchildren in elementary school, so why should I pay taxes? Why do I have to care that the kid across the street goes to school? Well, solidarity means you do care. Social Security is based on the concept of solidarity. You care that the widow across town has enough food to eat. The institution that was built on solidarity is the labor movement. Solidarity is its slogan. We're all in it together. We work together to try to achieve common goals. That's the ideal, at least. And a functioning society a healthy society will be built on the idea of
why is it important?
It's important for people to defend themselves, to protect themselves. If you're alone standing against concentrated power, you don't have a chance. If you're working with others, you do have a chance. You have the power of the majority, in fact, to defend your rights, to defend the rights of others. But there's also a simple ethical principle. Do we care about others? It's kind of interesting that if you go back to the icons of neoliberalism, like Adam Smith, he regarded sympathy as the most fundamental human emotion. In fact, it's kind of interesting to look at his notion of invisible hand, which everyone talks about. Take a look at what he actually meant by it. He barely used the term, so it's easy to find out. What he argued, for example, that suppose that it's an agricultural society. Suppose that some landlord accumulated most of the land and other people didn't have any. He said it wouldn't matter much because of the natural sympathy of the landowner for the fate of others. He would make sure that there's a relatively egalitarian distribution of resources, so as if by an invisible hand we would be saved from the destruction of concentration of power. That's Adam Smith. Compare it with what's now called libertarianism, which means we take what we want, the heck with everyone else.
Well, without solidarity, your society disintegrates, in essence, doesn't it?
And that's the point. Remember Margaret Thatcher? There's no society, right, which was an ideal, not a description. In fact, unwittingly, she was paraphrasing Marx, who condemned the French aristocracy after the repression because they were turning society into a sack of potatoes, an amorphous mass in which individuals could not participate and function. That's the neoliberal ideal, which Thatcher stated quite accurately.
Let's talk about run the regulators. And this has been the capture of regulatory agencies by the very industries that are supposed to be regulated.
It's called regulatory capture. It goes way back. Very commonly, the business world has actually instituted regulation, or supported it, to protect themselves from the highly destructive effects of an unregulated market, which can be extremely destructive, and the business world doesn't want to be destroyed. So they kind of either tacitly supported or sometimes even initiated regulation on the assumption that they would be able to take it over and regulate it in their interests. And to a very large extent this happens. So you find that the regulators for a particular industry are often very closely linked to the industries that they are regulating.
Well, we're watching that with the EPA, with Pruitt right now.
Well, that's a dramatic case where the EPA is actually being virtually dismantled. But you find it in the SEC, the railroad regulation.
The FCC.
Yeah, it's been very common.
But why is that? But I think you make an interesting point that kind of revolving door where people...
That's one of the techniques, is to... those who who Adam Smith called the masters of mankind, who have the resources and are being regulated, can offer all sorts of inducements, like when you leave, we'll give you a cushy job. One of the many devices by which wealth and power can ensure that the kind of regulation that takes place is in their interest. Doesn't work 100%, of course, but it's a very important tendency.
And yet I think you would say that after the 1960s, in the early 1970s, under of all things, the Nixon presidency, we had the consumer safety legislation, the safety and health regulations in the workplace, OSHA. We had the EPA, Clean Water Act, Mine and Safety Act, but these came out of movements.
They
right?
came out of the pressure of popular movements, just like the New Deal. If it hadn't been for CIO organizing, sit-down strikes, labor militancy, political activism, the New Deal policies wouldn't have been enacted. They're never gifts from... There happened to be a reasonably sympathetic administration in the 30s, but as Roosevelt himself pointed out, you better pressure me, otherwise I can't do it. That's one of the part of the significance of solidarity.
You talk about the nanny state. What do you mean? The nanny state. What do you mean by that?
The nanny state is a state that gives gifts to sectors that have the power to demand it, which typically means the rich and the powerful. I mean, there are, there's...
So is this like subsidies to the fossil fuel industry?
Well, there's hundreds of billions of dollars. I think it's something like $500 billion a year to the fossil fuel industry.
We're talking about government subsidies.
Plain government subsidies. Take, say, the financial industries, which the ones that exploded during the neoliberal period. There was an interesting IMF study that came out of International Monetary Fund a couple of years ago, which tried to determine the source of the profits of the 6 largest American banks. Turned out it's almost entirely public subsidy through the indirect effects of the implicit government guarantee. It's called informally too big to fail. It means that there's an implicit guarantee that they're not going to fail, which means you get access to cheap credit, inflated credit ratings, incentive to carry out risky, hence generally profitable transactions. If anything goes wrong, the public will bail you out. That amounts to, the business press estimated that at about $80 billion a year, just straight subsidy. In fact, everywhere you look, there's massive subsidy. And it's more than that. I mean, take, say, the high-tech economy, computers, internet, satellites, microelectronics, the components of your iPhone, whatever it may be. Almost invariably, they trace back to public subsidy in the state sector of the economy, either actual state sector, like places like this, which are fundamentally part of the state sector, or subsidy to IBM or something like that. And in fact, what typically happens, computers are a striking case, for decades, the risky and creative work is basically funded by the public. Finally, it's handed over to private corporations for marketing and profit. And they indeed are protected by monopoly pricing rights.
You had an interesting figure here. You said corporations spend about $2.6 billion a year on lobbying expenditures. That's more than the $2 billion we spend to fund the House at $1.18 billion and the Senate at $860 million. What does that say about our democracy?
Well, actually, the huge increase in lobbying also took place at this transition point between the regulated capitalism and the neoliberal capitalism. Early 70s, you start getting a very sharp increase in the number of lobbyists. In fact, it's probably more lobbyists.
Who are writing the legislation, literally.
They're basically writing the legislation. I mean, a congressperson usually relies on the staff to write the legislation, which maybe he or she tweaks and signs. What does the staff do? They consult with lobbyists, who are often experts in the area where they're writing the legislation. So they produce suggestions, sometimes actual texts of legislation, which then go to the congressperson.
Well, that's how we got Obamacare. Who wrote it? Liz
very
Fowler.
Much so. A lot of it came straight out of the insurance company.
Let me ask about engineering elections. Citizens United, of course, which creates this kind of legal fiction that this is the right to petition the government and free speech. The Democrats spent $1 billion on their election and lost. We just saw the most expensive House race in U.S. history in Georgia, which the Democrats also lost. What is this process? What have they done? Gerrymandering? I think we could argue that the Democratic Party is not, by the definition of a party, even a party. What's happened?
Well, first of all, we should recognize that this goes very far back. Back in 1895, the great campaign manager, Mark Hanna, was asked, what does it take to run a campaign? He said, there's two things. The first thing is money, and the second one I've forgotten. And there's been very good research into this. Thomas Ferguson's done a lot of it, some others, and it turns out that simply campaign spending is a very good predictor of electability. One of Ferguson's really recent studies is a detailed study of congressional elections from about 1980 to the present. And if you just take a look at that one variable, campaign funding, you get almost perfect prediction of who's going to be elected. And that, of course, means what policies are going to be instituted. Citizens United, of course, opened the doors even wider. But the idea that the corporate entities have the rights of persons, that goes back really to the early court decisions of the early 20th century.
Right.
And then it's been expanded. And by now, the Buckley v. Valeo, Citizens United have just basically opened the doors. So now it's out of sight. But it's striking that it can be overcome. The most dramatic feature of the last election, 2016, was not the victory of a billionaire with plenty of funding and huge media support. That's a little off the norm, but not much. It was the Sanders campaign.
We'll talk about that when we come back. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Professor Noam Chomsky. I want to move on to your eighth principle, keep the rabble in line, which maybe the seminal point of that is the breaking the labor movement. Breaking
the labor movement is critical. The U.S. Has a very violent labor history, much more so than comparable societies, all kinds of reasons. But the labor movement is, for example, hundreds of workers were literally being murdered in labor actions at a time when that was unheard of in Europe, Australia, elsewhere. In fact, repeatedly, the labor movement has just been smashed. By the 1920s, a very vibrant labor movement was just essentially wiped out. There's a book by one of the leading labor historians, David Montgomery, called The Fall of the House of Labor. It's about the 20s. It did revive in the 1930s.
Oh, we should say with the breakdown of capitalism.
After the Great Depression, really serious, worse than the 2007-8 crash, which was bad enough, the labor movement did reconstitute itself, and CIO organizing was critical, and pretty soon you had a powerful labor movement with many constructive effects on the society. Things were put on hold during the war. Immediately after the war, the attack on labor began.
Taft-Hartley.
Taft-Hartley in 1947.
McCarthyism.
Massive programs by capital to control schools, sports clubs, almost anything you can think of.
There's two. You point out that with this attack on labor came the ideology, one, demonizing government, and two, you say politicians always talk about jobs, but they never talk about profits.
That's an unpronounceable, obscene word. When a politician says, it means I want to defend profits. I don't care about jobs. That goes right to the present, to our current official leader. But you're not allowed to pronounce the word profits. That's an obscene word. So it's pronounced jobs. That's one of the devices like free trade and others that are used to mask policies that are, in fact, directed and oriented towards the masters of mankind and their welfare. And this is all, the attacks on labor are very significant because the labor movement is the one major organization in which much of the public, the general working public, can organize, get together to make decisions, to even have educational programs. And
yeah, you make that point that it's more than just organizing.
Oh, yeah.
It was about consciousness. It was about building community. It was awareness. Yeah. And, of course, now what are we down in the public sectors? Below 10% in terms of people who belong to unions.
And there's a coming attack on the last bastion.
Teachers.
The public's.
That's right.
We're going to have it pretty soon in the Supreme Court when a couple of cases are coming up which could justify what's called right-to-work legislation, which is another Orwellism. A right to work means right to scrounge. It means the right to be recognized and defended by a union, but not to pay for it.
Right.
And, of course, that has obvious consequences.
I want to talk about principle number 9, manufacturing consent, which comes out of your great book, Manufacturing Consent, with Edward Herman, a phrase taken from Walter Lippmann. And that's extremely important because it's been very successful. The public relations industry, working on behalf of corporations and government, has very effectively, if we want to go back to the word, indoctrinated the public. Speak a little bit about that, what they've done to our consciousness.
Well, the public relations industry, which is a huge industry, of course, is developed in the freest societies in the world, in Britain and the United States, out of a recognition that enough freedom had been won that people can't be controlled by violence easily. So therefore you have to control their opinions and attitudes. And this was quite explicit, early 20th century. You have to make Lippmann, who's a striking example because he's kind of a Wilson, Roosevelt, Kennedy liberal, regarded as one of the great defenders of democracy. But his view was that the public had really no role in public affairs.
This is public opinion.
They should be spectators, not participants. And the what he called the responsible men, serious guys like us, we should really run things in the interests of the general public, who are stupid and ignorant and don't understand what's good for them. That's an essential feature of liberal democratic theory. See it all over the place, goes way back. That's one aspect of it. The other aspect is simply driving people towards what the business press called the fashionable things, the superficial things of life, like fashionable consumption. If you can direct people to spend their time buying the latest gadget that they don't want.
Well, you call them uninformed consumers who will make irrational choices.
Yeah, which is an interesting concept, because if you ever took an economics course, you know that markets are based on informed consumers making rational choices. And it's somehow overlooked that we have a huge industry, hundreds of billions of dollars a year, trying to undermine markets by creating uninformed consumers who will make irrational choices. Now, that's what every advertisement
is. And you carry this through to elections. You say what they also create is an uninformed electorate that will make irrational choices against their own interests.
Well, let's take the last election as an example. A particularly striking feature of it was that issues were ignored in favor of personalities. So
hasn't that been true for a long time, though?
It's been true for a very long time, but here it was really dramatic. After all, we are facing two existential crises, new in human history. One, which has been going on for a while, is the threat of nuclear war, which is in fact increasing. The other is the threat of environmental catastrophe. Now, take a look at how much coverage there was of that in the last 2 elections. Just these 2 things.
Well, even on the media, it's not just coverage. The media doesn't. All they talk about is Russia.
Not an issue, yeah. Talk about marginal issues. And in fact, there is a media principle, which you know better than I do, that is called objectivity, which means pay attention to what's happening within the Beltway. If you can report accurately what's happening there, you're objective. Talk about something else, you're biased.
Well, it's gossip. Most of it's gossip.
Bias. And since within the Beltway they're talking about what's important to power, you keep to that.
The last point, marginalize the population. What do you mean by that?
It means make sure that the public is what Marx called a sack of potatoes, an amorphous mass, what Thatcher called eliminate society, just have individuals. When you just have scattered, atomized individuals, not linked to one another, not connected by active, functioning organizations, they're going to be victims.
And you say, you raise this point, you say that what this does is it creates an unfocused anger that supports political figures whose goal is to harm them, the population, as much as possible.
That's exactly what we see dramatically, not just in the United States, but all over the industrial world. There's a tremendous amount of anger, hatred of institutions, collapse of centrist political organizations. Some of it's organized and effective, like, for example, the Sanders campaign or the Corbyn phenomenon in England or Podemos in Spain. It's there. But a lot of it is just basically anger. We're being badly treated, which is correct. Nobody's paying attention to us, which is correct. Nobody's defending our interests, correct. That's a perfect situation for a demagogue to appear and say, I'm the guy who's going to protect you. So just believe what I say. I'm going to bring jobs. I'm going to make the country great. I'm going to do all these wonderful things. Meanwhile, while I'm the focus of television attention, in the background, my associates are busy passing legislation, issuing directives which are undermining and destroying you. We see it very clearly in the current so-called health plan, which has nothing to do with health. It's a program of tax reduction for the very wealthy.
And Obamacare was already a corporate...
Obamacare was a bit of an improvement on what existed, nowhere near what it should have been.
You talk about values. You say that in a society based on control by private wealth, the society reflects those values, which are greed and the desire to maximize personal gain at the expense of the other. Now, a small society based on that principle is ugly, but it can survive. A global society based on that principle is headed for massive destruction, which is us.
Yes, and there's very simple reasons. Take the environmental crisis, which is very real, and it's not centuries away. It's imminent, next couple of decades. If individuals are geared to maximizing their own individual gain, let's get the fastest car that I can, use as much fossil fuels as I can, forget whether my grandchildren will have a place to live, it's not my business, forget the tens of millions of people in Bangladesh who are going to be inundated by sea level rise, not my business, then we're heading to the precipice. And we won't escape. We won't escape, but it'll be not far down the road. So yes, that's inherent in market societies based on, with a public consciousness based on individual gain and greed and lack of concern for others.
Great. Thank you. That was Professor Noam Chomsky. Thank you for watching. For more of our conversation with Professor Noam Chomsky, go to rt.com/oncontact. I'll see you next week.